The I think must be able to accompany all my representations. In other words, the relation between representations presuppose a subject, an I, that holds together all these representations. Only in the I can objects be posited and related using the categories like cause and effect, affirmation and negation. Think for example of a moving car. A car is only moving to the extent that a subject is capable of remembering the previous location of the car, in both space and time. If you were a goldfish and forgot every previous account, the concept of speed does not exist for this subject. Now, this is where Kant and Fichte left us in the previous videos. Kant gave us the categories of the understanding, the tools to synthesize representations, but he never gave us the derivation of these categories. This is where Fichte wanted to contribute to Kant's foundation of transcendental philosophy. And this side note of Kant that states that the I think must be able to accompany all my representations is exactly the starting point of Fichte's science of knowledge. For every judgment of affirmation like A equals A, we presuppose a subject for which this is true. Even if A is a contradiction in itself, for the subject, the I, the proposition A equals A still holds. Therefore, Fichte starts his science with the first principle which states I am I, pure self-positing. Fichte calls it Tathandlung, deed and action. The thinker and the thought are one and the same, just as seeing and the sight that is seen are one and the same. This is the category of reality. However, we do not have consciousness with only reality. We also need opposition. Therefore, the second principle reads, I does not equal not I. This is the category of negation. Now, we cannot have both an I and a non-I in the same consciousness at the same time, for they would cancel each other out. We know this is, however, what happens since we are self-conscious. So, how is this solved? Answer: by the third principle. That is, they can only exist if they mutually limit each other. Therefore, the third principle reads, in the absolute I oppose a divisible non-I to the divisible I. A full explanation of these first principles is given in the previous video on Fichte. We now have three principles: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. But we are now left with two new main antitheses. Namely, the I posits the non-I as determined by the I, that is, the I determines the non-I, it acts or is practical, and the I posits itself as determined by the non-I, that is, the I posits itself as affected, it perceives or is theoretical. In other words, it is the problem of the chicken and the egg. Which is first, the I or the non-I? To synthesize this is our current aim, to find a way in which both the I and non-I are both posited and are positing, where both the chicken and the egg can be both cause and effect. We can only make Fichte's search for self-consciousness a science if we are able to synthesize these two propositions. In this video, we will thus answer the question, how are we self-conscious? Let us begin by looking at the definition of consciousness. For what does this mean? For something to be conscious, that something must be posited for the I. However, it cannot accomplish this in one act, since originally the positing of the I itself is the act. The I's own positing of itself is thus its own pure activity. It is at once the agent and the product of action, the active and what the activity brings about. It is like sight, for example, where by seeing something, it is not the act of seeing that we see. The only way in which we become conscious of positing is when the positing itself is interrupted and reflected onto itself. In other words, when we see that we are seeing. It is only when the subject becomes object that we can become self-conscious. And precisely because the self-conscious I is activity and conscious of this activity, it has a genesis, a history behind it. This is what Fichte calls the pragmatic history of the mind. The task forward is thus set. We have to reconstruct this genesis of consciousness to see if it leads back to our starting point. So, let us now start this reconstruction. Originally, the I is nothing but activity. However, it cannot become conscious of this fact unless the activity meets with something that checks it and thus prevents it from tailing off into infinity. Without an Anstoß, the I could never posit itself as I. It could never become finite and conscious of itself. Now then, how does it come to be conscious of itself? As we had seen in the example of seeing, we need something that stops the activity in order to reflect on the seeing. In Lacanian terms, this would be the point where the unconscious subject runs into the other, even in the form of other subjects. It runs into a brick wall of language, symbols and restriction, even without consciously knowing that the I is restricted. This results in a feeling of impeded activity, a feeling of incapacity. We as observers say, the I has sensation. It is the Lacanian lack that results from our infinite activity meeting with limitation. The otherness, the stranger in my very heart, which Fichte endeavored to discern under the name of Anstoß, is the bone in the throat which prevents the direct expression of the subject, and which, since the subject is the failure of its own direct expression, is strictly correlative to the subject. Which means that the minimal emptying of subject, the reduction of its reality, of its thingness, is constitutive of subjectivity. The subject is caught in its loop because it is not all, finite, lacking, because a loss of reality is co-substantial with it, and Anstoß is the positivation of this gap. So, when the I runs into the Anstoß, the other, we sense a lack. In the next step, the I has to become conscious of itself as sensing. It has to become conscious of the feeling of being checked or impeded. In order to determine it, reflection posits something in opposition to feeling that is not feeling, an impeding factor. In other words, the I now posits a non-I, which is doing the bounding of its activity. It is here for the first time that a distinction is made between inside and outside, between subject and object. It is where we cross from the first to the second graph of Lacan, where the other is now become distinct from the subject. Thus, in this step, the I moves from sensation to intuition, intuition of something and no longer mere sensation. Even though at this stage we do not yet know what the other in reality is. So, when the I posits a non-I in opposition to itself, we are intuiting the objective from the subjective. Now, at this ensuing stage, the I again becomes conscious of its activity. That is, its activity of positing the non-I. In this way, the non-I is a product of the I. Or, in the words of Fichte, furthermore, the I is supposed to posit its product, the opposed and bounding non-I, as its product. The distinguishing feature of such a product is that it could also be different than it is, and could be posited as such. Insofar as the non-I is recognized as the product of the I must now unify for itself the activity of itself and of the other. In this way, intuition is both limited and free. In other words, since the I posits the non-I, but it cannot be both I and other itself, the non-I becomes an image or representation for the I. So, in order to become conscious of its activity of positing a non-I, the I creates a representation of the non-I. In Lacan's famous paper on the mirror stage, it is the other that we see in the mirror, our specular image. This representation of everything that we lack due to our encounter with the other, with language and law. So, intuition now posits an image or representation of the non-I, since it cannot be both I and non-I. Now, the thing is that this image or representation of the non-I is not just anything, since an image in the proper sense of the term is an image of something that is not itself an image, but rather that of which the image is an image. In other words, we now have the representation of a thing, but also the thing itself. In Lacanian terms, we have the signifier and the signified. They are linked, but the representation is never the thing. So, when we create the representation of the thing in the previous step, we run into the limitation of this not being the actual thing. So, we now have in our subject both the representation and the intuition of the thing, and our imagination mediates between the two. Now, at the next stage, we have to become conscious of imagination. In other words, we have to see that we are imagining. Since the imagination is infinitely oscillating between opposites, the I and the non-I, we need to limit this activity in order to capture it. Note that we do not stop the imagining, we only capture and fix it by pausing just long enough to determine it and distinguish it from others. This is what Fichte calls the understanding, or to bring to a standstill. If the unconscious activity of fixation involved here, that is, concept formation, is to become conscious, then the I must reflect on the fixed product. The I, therefore, determines itself to conceptually determine the concept of the object. It is precisely here, though, that the spontaneity of reflection comes to light, for positive determination involves the exclusion of everything else from which one has abstracted for purpose of determination. The product of this new reflection is the consciousness of a freedom to reflect on something and thus to abstract from other things, to combine specific features while separating others out. This is what Fichte calls the power of judgment. It is the faculty of reflecting on objects that are already posited in the understanding. Or, when we go back to Kant, it is the power of judgment which simultaneously creates concepts through synthesis and also which acts on these concepts using the categories of the understanding. So, when a manifold of representations is fixed in a concept, it can be thrown back onto itself by the power of judgment. And it is precisely when we are able to abstract from all objects that self-consciousness arises. For self-consciousness is reflecting on the judgments on objects. In other words, it is seeing that we are seeing, or determining that we are determining. Everything the I abstracts from, everything I can think away, is not my I, and I posit in opposition to my I merely by regarding it as something I can think away. The more a determinate individual can think away from himself, the closer does his empirical self-consciousness approximate to a pure self-consciousness. This is what Lacan means when he says, it is not that consciousness creates language, but rather, consciousness is language. It is our ability to describe, and thus to abstract from everything that is not the subject, not the activity. This is thus where the pragmatic history of the human mind results in self-consciousness as the ability to abstract from all objects whatsoever. In other words, we end at the beginning, where the I posits itself as determined by the non-I. It is when the I runs into other subjects that it is thrown back onto itself. This reflection forces the subject to go inward and reflect on its own positing. This works, of course, in both ways. We reflect because of the other, and the other reflects because they're run in with us. Self-consciousness is thus only possible insofar as there are other consciousnesses. In other words, no you, no I, no you. Without the other, there is no I, and without the I, there is no other. In the theoretical part, we have seen that the I is dependent on the non-I, or, in other words, on the other, in order to become self-conscious. Now, we were also left with the practical part, where the I should be independent of the non-I, that is, where the I posits itself, where it acts or is practical. In other words, we are left with the contradiction: the I is to have causality in relation to the non-I, or the I cannot have causality in relation to the non-I, since the latter would then not be a non-I, but rather a product of the I. The I is thus limited and unlimited at the same time. But how can this contradiction be resolved? Well, there is an activity which is both limited and unlimited, and that is called striving. For a striving is present whenever there is a check or hindrance which is resisted, such that the activity, rather than being negated, aspires to overcome it. In other words, if the activity of the I would stop when meeting the restriction of the other, there would never be a reflection on its activity. That is, no self-consciousness. However, we know that when we meet with the restriction of the big other, we have a lack that strives for fulfillment. It creates a desire instead of a stop on the activity. This was the starting point of Lacan's theory. Thus, the original activity of the I must be a striving. Now, just not to lose sight of our goal, let's summarize what we have so far. The I is Tathandlung, activity directed purely at itself, it posits itself. The I is what it is for itself, it must be conscious of itself. To become conscious of itself, it must reflect on itself. And to reflect on itself, it must distinguish itself from itself, and it must become an object for itself. The I, according to its idea, is all reality. In order for it to be for itself what it is in itself, it must be for itself all reality. In other words, from our subjective perspective, we are all reality. Whenever I doubt, I cannot doubt that I exist, since I am thinking that I exist. Okay, in order to be for itself, it must reflect on itself. And in order to reflect on itself, it must be limited and thus finite. That is, it cannot be all reality. It cannot be both, but it ought to be, since it is one and the same I. The identity of the I is not given, but assigned as a task. It strives for self-identity. Thus, if the contradiction between the finite and the infinite I, between the dependence and independence from the non-I is to be resolved, then the original activity of the I must be a striving. If the derivation was correct, then the actuality of practical self-consciousness must in turn be derivable from this activity together with the experience of resistance. The remaining task is therefore again set: reconstructing practical self-consciousness from a striving for self-identity, a striving for the filling of a lack. In other words, the theoretical gave us an abstract, cold reconstruction of self-consciousness. Now, in the practical, we look at it from the perspective of the self, the feeling of the subject from our experience. And, as we have said, we start with a striving. That is, a striving towards an yet undefined object. But a self-productive striving that is fixed, determined, and defined in character is also known as a drive. So, we have a striving and an object, and the equilibrium between the two is known as the drive. And this we have seen also in Lacan's theory on desire. And here the principle is the same. Since a drive towards an object is also a drive towards a limitation, the activity of striving is thrown back onto itself. This reflection is felt as a feeling of impeded activity, a restricted striving, and at this stage there is only the feeling of force. Now, the limitation set by the I itself results in a feeling of force. So now, from the perspective of the I, this restriction must be something that is not the I. In other words, the I now retroactively projects the limitation onto a non-I, which is doing the limiting. So now, for the first time in this reflection, the I finds an I and a non-I, and hence a self-feeling arises. We feel ourselves. In other words, in the theoretical, the I met with the other, the anstos. It is in this encounter that the I is forced to reflect on its own activity. Here, the I had causality in relation to the non-I. But now, in the practical, this is different. The I feels a drive, a striving, from within itself. In its striving, the I feels a force acting against it. It feels a lack, a void. In this feeling of force, the I feels itself, since a feeling can only be in the I, in the subject that feels the feeling. But now, we have a positing I and a posited I. And something interesting happens. Since the I cannot be both feeling and that which is felt from the perspective of the I. Therefore, the I retroactively creates a non-I, which takes responsibility for the action of the I. However, the non-I is just the I in disguise. But this is something we have seen before. We have seen it in the theory of subjectivity from Lacan, where the subject is split between the unconscious and the false being, between the will and the representation, the signifier and the signified. The I can now abstract between the thinker of the thought and the thought itself, between thinking and being. We feel that we are the thinker of our thought, but in reality it is the other that is thinking for us. We use the language of the big other. For what else are thoughts than the language that we learned from others? We now have a theoretical I, an I affected by the other. It is the other, or my confrontation with the other, that makes me conscious of myself. No you, no I. And we have a practical I. An I that is positing itself. An I that creates the other by its own act. It is the subject that confronts the other, and in this confrontation makes the other self-conscious. No I, no you. We have the determining of the I and determining of the other. So now, the last step. How are they unified? How can a striving of the I and the striving of the other be one and the same? This is the case when the drive leads to an action which is done for the sake of the drive, or when the action satisfying the drive is the drive itself. And such a drive towards action for the sake of the drive is the moral drive. That is, the will insofar as it is determined only by itself. The I experiences its harmony with itself, albeit only briefly, in moral action. The harmony exists and a feeling of approval ensues, which, in this case, is a feeling of contentment, of repletion, of utter completeness. In other words, there is a place where the striving of the I overlaps with the striving of the other, of you. That is, in moral action, where deed and action are one and the same, where the thinker, the I, and the thought, the other, are one and the same. We find ourselves back at the beginning where we started, with a deed and an action being one and the same, Tathandlung. We have confirmed our hypothesis, we have created a science from philosophy. Thank you for watching this video. This was one of the hardest videos we have ever made, hence the 6 months delay. I hope that this video will aid you somewhat in your journey, that we are all one step closer to explaining ourselves to ourselves, in explaining our self-consciousness. And lastly, I hope that something good happens to you today, you stranger in my very heart, and to see you in the next video.